for the Clean Water Council. He's also the chair of the University of Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Advisory Board. And he had a career for about 30 years with the Three Rivers Park District. He was the water resources manager and then moved on to director of natural resources. And I've had the pleasure of getting to know John through a sustainability council that we worked on at our church, and learned over time that John is indeed a very much long-time outdoor enthusiast. He is an avid biker, kayaker, cross-country skier, and loves the outdoors. So tonight he is going to speak to us about the current state of the Crow River, and including the impairments and stressors that we do need to know about. And he's also going to share with us efforts to improve the quality and how we can all participate in improving the health of the Crow River. So I just wanted to let you know we are going to be recording the meeting tonight. And yes, we see that in the chat if you didn't see that already. With that, I'll just pass it on to John and let you take it from here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Nikki. And first of all, I'd like to thank Nikki and Renee for putting this together, along with all of the other activities. I think very important, and it helps us all to maybe focus a little bit more on the environment. Now, I'm going to talk a lot about the quality and the quantity problems and concerns that are in the Crow River right now that we're dealing with as communities and as individuals. My background, though, I've had a long, storied relationship with the Crow River. I actually grew up in a little town in Stearns County that was right adjacent to the Crow River watershed. But I worked for one of my uncles who was a farmer, and half of his land drained to the Crow River and half of it drained to the Sauk River basin. So that was my start with the Crow River. And I happened to marry a woman who grew up about a quarter mile on a farm from the Crow River. I have some brother-in-laws who farm right next to the Crow River. So a lot of involvement there. And for my master's research project, I actually did a study on Lake Coronis. If you're familiar with Lake Coronis by Paynesville, the Crow River runs in the north end and out the south end. So I've done a lot of canoeing, a lot of fishing, and just being involved in the Crow River, as well as a lot of monitoring of the water quality in the Crow River, although admittedly that was some years ago. So I'm going to talk about some of those experiences as we go along tonight, I hope. Here we go. Okay, I had to throw this out there. By training, I am a limnologist, and I got this little bumper sticker from my granddaughters, which is why I needed to show it here. They thought it was kind of interesting to have a strange grandfather with a strange working title. Not that that's the only thing strange about me, in their humble opinion. Okay? So I'm a limnologist by training, so I study inland fresh water throughout most of my career. So the Crow River obviously is part of that. And so here are some of the basic physical characteristics of the Crow River. There's about 224 miles of stream. Okay, that's the main river channel, the North Fork, the Middle Fork, and the South Fork. With the ditches and the creeks and everything that run into it, it's actually over 1,000 miles of channels per se. But the main stem, about 224 miles. Watershed area of about 1.8 million acres. So quite a large watershed contributing drainage to Crow River system. 858 lakes in the drainage basin, which is really a lot. Although admittedly, anything over 10 acres is classified as a lake. That's how we got to 14,842 lakes in Minnesota. There are 60 municipalities in the watershed, which surprised me. I didn't realize this until I started doing some research for this presentation. There's a lot of towns in the Crow River watershed. There's 9 counties that have land that contributes water to the Crow River system. But about 75% of the land of that 1.8 million acres is an agricultural productivity. So I'm going to say quite a bit about agricultural activities and how they impact Crow River. I don't want to pick on farmers. I want to make it clear it's only because 75% of the watershed is an agricultural use. Therefore, 75% about of the impacts on the river are from agriculture. So there are a number of impairments, and by definition, an impairment is simply a concentration or a pollutant that does not allow a river or a lake to meet a desired use. That use could be recreation, that use could be industrial, irrigation, water supply, aesthetics, or basically just the biology of the lake. Most of these are pretty self-explanatory. I just wanted to point out a couple. Chloride, of course, is just salt. So sodium chloride, nothing different than table salt. So that's one of the impairments. Macroinvertebrates, a little harder to understand. The picture in the upper right-hand corner of the screen are clams and mussels, okay? Zebra mussels on a native clam. Those are macroinvertebrates. You see dragonflies out today? Dragonfly nymphs live in the river in an immature stage. Those are also invertebrates. Okay, so those are the types of things that the river is impaired for, along with fish and its IBI, which stands for Index of Biological Integrity. Simply means that instead of supporting game fish like northern pike or bass, it supports carp and bullhead. Okay, so we've transitioned away. So those are the impairments in the Crow River. Now, I should point out that not all of the 224 miles of stream are impaired for all of these contaminants. Rivers and streams are separated into segments called reaches, and I'm not sure the exact origin of that. I should have looked it up, but I neglected to do that. But a reach is like the river between, for instance, Delaware and Rockford is a reach. So there are 40 reaches of the rivers that are impacted for some or all of these contaminants. So not the entire river system is impaired. And what's causing the impairments is by and large altered hydrology. And what altered hydrology simply means is that we are now running more water into the river faster than historically happened. And therefore, the river has to change to accommodate that flow. Sort of like if you had a 12-inch pipe and it was full of water, and now all of a sudden you've got enough water to fill up a 15-inch pipe. Well, that water can't fit, right? Same thing happens in a river. So we have 15 inches of water in a 12-inch pipe. So the river has to accommodate or has to change in order to accommodate that flow. And it does it in a number of ways. One, it cuts a deeper channel, which makes the sides steeper. In addition, the river wants to get wider, which of course erodes away the banks. So then you have the banks and the sediment falling into the river, as you see in the bottom photo here. And that is caused by a number of different things. A big factor with altering the hydrology of the river and running more water into the river faster is agricultural drainage. We have ditched and tiled most of the cropland in the Crow River Basin. Approximately 45% of all the land in the Crow River Basin, agricultural land that is tile drained. So that those tiles outlet into ditches, flow into streams or creeks, which flow into the river. So that gets a lot more water a lot faster into the river. And then you add to that the urban impervious surface area from those 60 municipalities I discussed earlier. And an impervious surface is simply a road, a driveway, sidewalk, a rooftop where the water can't infiltrate when the rain falls on those surfaces. Instead, it runs off, and since we collect it in storm sewer system, we pipe it into the river really, really fast. So again, we're adding more water to the river faster than it historically did. And one of the bigger things is we have changing rainfall patterns due to climate change. We're all aware that we're getting a lot heavier rain events occurring more and more frequently in Minnesota. So we're getting flooding and a lot of these river impacts occurring simply because of the changing rainfall patterns due to climate change. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a couple of minutes. But that altered hydrology is what drives most of these impairments. Of the 40 impairments in the Crow River system, 29 or about 75% are caused by altered hydrology. This is a huge problem for us. And that leads to a lot of this stream bank erosion, which causes the turbidity and low dissolved oxygen and some of those other impairments. Okay. The estimate is that 60% of the sediment in the Crow River is a result of stream bank erosion, which again is caused by the altered hydrology. Some of the other impairments, like salt, is due to road and water softener salt discharges into the river, either from direct runoff from our streets and roadways or from the wastewater treatment plant discharging water softener salt. And we have fertilizer runoff primarily from ag fields, but also from people fertilizing their lawns. Okay, and that has because it has such a direct connection to the river. Mainly it runs from your lawn into the street and then immediately into a river or a flowing water body. So that's a huge problem for us. And then bacteria in the river is caused primarily by manure, but also by septic systems that aren't quite functioning the way they're supposed to. So these are the primary causes and stressors. And as I mentioned, altered hydrology is one of the major issues. And to point that out, here is one of the primary climate change impacts. The historic 100-year rainfall event in the Crow River Basin used to be 5.8 inches in 24 hours. And that's kind of an average over the Crow River watershed. The current 100-year rainfall event is over 7 inches in 24 hours. So we're dealing with 1.2 additional inches on average. And you can take any rainfall time sequence you want, a 50-year event, 25-year event, 10-year event, and they all increased over the last 20 to 30 years as a result of our climate change. Now, whenever you mention climate change or global warming or what have you, people tend to get a little bit, or some people tend to get a little bit miffed about it, and they look at it as a political issue, not as a scientific issue. And I'm going to digress a little bit away from the Crow River just to address that topic because I think it's very important. Okay. The whole theory behind climate change was really predicated on what's called the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect is nothing more than there's something above the ground that traps heat. Okay. And this was first postulated in 1824. So think about that. 1824 has nothing to do with current politics. And it was shown experimentally in 1859, so over 150 years ago. And the reason scientists were looking at that incidentally is because they're trying to explain the difference between the actual temperature of the Earth, which is 15 degrees, and the theoretical, which is 5.3 degrees. And the theoretical was really basically scientists looking at the Earth as rounds. For instance, if you stand in a valley in Colorado, you can be standing in 90-degree heat and you look up and 10 miles away, there's a snow-capped mountain peak, right? So the question is, why isn't it 90 degrees on top of that mountain? Well, we all know that as you climb a mountain, the air gets thinner, right? Basically, there's less atmosphere between you and the sun, so you don't trap as much heat. So it's just, in essence, it's just kind of common sense, right? So the more atmosphere you have over the Earth, the more heat is trapped. So scientists have known this for about 150 years. And in 1903, Svante Arrhenius, who was a Swedish chemist, developed the theory that it was carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that was responsible for trapping heat. So scientists earlier knew that it was something in the atmosphere. It could have been oxygen or the nitrogen or the methane, but he determined that it was carbon dioxide and predicted in 1905, so 115 years ago already, that raising the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere would increase the global mean temperature. And he was right. So this really had nothing to do with current politics, which a lot of people try to blame the climate change or global warming thing on politics. It isn't. It's really just basic pure science. Okay, now I'm going to go back to the Crow River again. but I do think that the climate change impacts are significant in some of these impairments. Of course, why do we care about these impairments? You know, what difference does it make other than for people who happen to love the river? Well, there are a lot of problems that are caused by these impairments that affect us directly. And there's a list of them here, and I'm going to go through these one by one. So, loss of recreational opportunity. Everybody in Minnesota who fishes likes to catch walleyes or bass or northern. When you have these types of impairments, as I mentioned earlier, you transition the fishing resources over to carp and bullheads and sheephead and things like that. And because the river affects the lakes, as I mentioned, I did my master's research on Lake Coronis, which is the quality of Lake Coronis impacted significantly by the Crow River. So when you impair the Crow River, you impair Lake Coronis, and you transition Lake Coronis from a walleye fishery or a bass fishery into a carp fishery. And that has huge economic impacts in addition to a recreational impact. In addition, nobody wants to boat or canoe in green, scummy messes like this, right? Because this is not very aesthetically pleasing. And since the Crow River is a state water trail, degrading the river is really impacting the recreational ability to both fish in the river as well as canoe and kayak on the river. So we lose our recreational opportunities when these impairments continue. We also have a lot of increased flooding because of that altered hydrology. I think everyone has seen the road closed signs between Delano and Rockford on County Road 50 as it makes the bend, the north end of Rebecca Park Reserve, where the Crow River floods and it covers the road. Well, that impacts travel. It impacts the road because you undermine the road by getting the base too wet, so the road tends to crack up. In addition, to prevent the flooding from some of these rain events and the increased flow, we have to build dikes. And there's a dike running the length of the Delano downtown area. Very expensive and very expensive to maintain. Now the picture here, I could have included a picture of the Delano dike, but I didn't because I wanted to make a couple of points. This picture, which is in your upper left, is the New Orleans dike. And off to your right is the lower Ninth Ward, which is famous following the Hurricane Katrina flooding. To the left is the Mississippi River. Now, the level of ground in the lower Ninth Ward is about 9 feet below river level. You ask yourself, why would anybody build a city where you're lower than the river? But the dike keeps it out. Okay. Now, this is a case in point. There is a river in China called the Yellow River, which carries more silt in the water than any other river in the world. And over the centuries, the Chinese have been diking this river, putting dikes up on both sides in order to protect the surrounding property. Now, it turns out that when you put dikes along a river and channelize the flow and don't allow the river to spill out onto its floodplain, the sediment level of the river increases dramatically. So this happened in the Yellow River over a couple of thousand years. So today, the bottom of the Yellow River is 46 feet above the surrounding floodplain. So when the river overtops the dikes or cuts through the dike, you get huge flooding concerns. And that's why when you hear of floods in China along some of the rivers, you have 10, 20, 30, and one of the latest ones in the Yellow River is 150,000 people drowned because of that. And that's because of this diking thing. Now, we don't exactly know how bad the dike in Delano is going to affect the sedimentation of the river, but we assume it's going to have some impact. So the dikes do keep the water out and prevent some of this flooding, but the long-term impacts are not quite known. In addition, it's very expensive to maintain them. And then you got to pump the water from one side to the other. This again, the picture in the center is from New Orleans, and they have a 5-foot high multiple pipes where the water is being pumped from the city into the Mississippi River. In Delano, of course, we have much smaller pipes, but it's still a proposition that has to happen every time the river gets high. So increased flooding, which is an impairment, is a big problem for them. And then infrastructure problem. This happens to be at the very south edge of Delano along River Street. I don't know if you can see it, but off to the right of the picture is St. Peter's Church. And looking straight down the river is downtown Delano. So in order to prevent the river from washing away the road, which you see on the left-hand corner as these banks start to slough in, it was threatening to take out the road, right? So we had to put in, or the city had to put in sheet pilings right along the cap of this structure, and then put riprap along the river in order to protect the road. Your other alternative would be to move the road, which means you had to buy houses and move the entire system. Any one of those options would be hundreds of thousands of dollars, including this stabilization structure. North of Delano, by the Sportsman Club, you have the same thing. Corps of Engineers in Hennepin County, in order to protect County Road 50, had to do the same thing. So they invested over $1 million to protect the county road running along the gun club area. So these things are not only a problem for the river in terms of the ecology of the river, they're also a huge economic drain for us citizens. Nutrient loss is kind of the same thing. The map in the upper left-hand corner shows the entire Mississippi River drainage basin. And in the Gulf of Mexico, you have this hypoxic zone, which has been developing over the last 20 or 30 years because of all the nitrogen that has been flowing down from the rivers like the Crow into the Mississippi and then into the Gulf of Mexico. The hypoxic zone is bigger than the state of Rhode Island currently. Basically, it's killed pretty much all life in that hypoxic zone. Now, not only is this an ecological problem, but it's also an economic problem, because when the fertilizer we put on our farm fields and our lawns is washing down into the river system, we're not getting any value for it. And we're talking here thousands of tons of nitrogen fertilizer that's washing down the river from the Mississippi drainage basin and the Crow River basin. So when you have high nitrate levels in the Crow River that are causing an impairment, that nitrogen is coming from somewhere, and that somewhere is generally either your lawns or agricultural fields. So that fertilizer is not being used to raise crops, it's being wasted. And that's an economic loss to the farming community. Soil loss is similar. When you have the stream banks eroding away, that increases the sediment in the river, and that's 60% of the sediment load. The other 40% is coming primarily from field runoff. And as all farmers do know, you can only lose so much of the topsoil before your fertility level of the soil decreases. And in order to maintain productivity, you have to add more fertilizer and you have to add more pesticides and herbicides, which then increases the problem. So all of these things are bad economically as well as bad environmentally. And then there's always a possible water treatment plant impact. The map on your left in orange show areas that are impacted by chloride or have chloride impairment. Crow River is part of that. Okay? And what that means is there's too much salt in the water. Most of those impairments, as you can see, are in the metropolitan area where we have the freeways and we have the roads and streets and residential areas that are getting salt, and all of that is washing into the metropolitan area water body, causing these impairments. But you'll notice that there are a number of rural areas that also have high chloride content. Generally speaking, those are because of wastewater treatment plant discharges into sensitive lakes or streams, and it's water softener salt. So you have to deal with it. How do cities deal with it? In some instances, they build softening plants at the main water treatment facility, right? Again, millions of dollars in order to soften the water before they distribute that water to the customers in order to reduce that chloride in the water. The other problem is high nitrate levels. There are currently 3 Minnesota municipalities that are dealing with excessive nitrate levels in their water supply system. and that's very expensive to deal with it. Mankato being one of it. And the Mankato example, the Mankato wells are right adjacent to the Minnesota River. They're actually drawing water from under the river. And because there's so much nitrate in the river, seeping into the groundwater, and they were drawing it in, and they have to treat it to get rid of that nitrate. The city of Des Moines, Iowa, spending $27 million to upgrade their plant to remove nitrate, primarily coming in from agricultural drainage ditches and streams. So this is a huge problem for us economically, again, well, environmentally. And that's because there is no such thing as an isolated surface water and isolated groundwater, or rivers and lakes. All of it is interconnected. Picture on your left shows an area in southern Minnesota that we visited with the Clean Water Council about a year and a half ago. Is water coming out of a bank. Basically, it's a spring down there. They put dye in the water about 2 miles. There's a sinkhole about 2 miles from the site. And in less than 24 hours, that dye was coming out of the spring. So there's a direct connection between surface water and groundwater. Same thing is true of wells, okay? Especially in sensitive areas, sandier soils as an example, in the upper level or the upper reaches of the Crow River, the Bonanza Valley area around Belgrade, Bruton, very sandy soil, a lot of nitrogen problems. In fact, the Department of Ag has been doing some monitoring of private wells. They sampled about 20,000 wells from 2013 to 2016, 9.5%. So almost 2,000 of those wells had high nitrate concentrations above the drinking water standard. And this 10 milligrams per liter isn't just a number pulled out of the air. Anything above this is what causes what's called blue baby syndrome. So if young children and babies drink this water, they can't take up enough oxygen and they kind of turn blue, which is why it's called blue baby syndrome. So again, a huge problem for us. So when we contaminate the river and we have these nitrate impairments, we're also affecting our drinking water supply in many areas. So question is, well, what do we need to do to solve all this? Because the majority of these impairments, 29 out of 40, are caused by altered hydrology, the big thing that we need to do is to stabilize these stream flows, which means we have to store more water on the land. The plan, which I'll discuss in just a minute, predicts that we have to store 104,000 acre feet of water in the Crow River in storage basins. That's 104,000 acres a foot deep of water. That's a lot of water. So we have to restore some of these wetlands, and we have to build some detention ponds and probably revisit how we operate our tile line. Now, for a lot of people, that is like the bottom cartoon. We're taking something away from our agricultural producers and our citizens. So it's a hard sell, but it really needs to be done. A more efficient way in many instances to reduce the amount of water running off the land, in order to store more on the land, is to improve the soil water holding capacity. You've probably all heard the term soil health. It's been one of the buzzwords that's been going around for a while recently. And what improving the soil health is, and this, the plans for the Crow River include a lot of that, is basically having green cover or cover crops, which incidentally the president mentioned in his speech last night, which is kind of interesting, or reducing the, or excuse me, increasing the vegetative cover or crop residue on the land over the winter, so you don't have bare soil from late fall to early spring when crops start to grow again, or putting in more permanent vegetative cover like alfalfa and some of those types of crops. There's a huge initiative going on to try to do that. And in the Crow River watershed, that is one of the objectives of many of the best management practices that the stormwater conservation districts are working with farmers to implement. That really needs to happen in order to stabilize those stream flows and reduce some of those impairments, stop the flooding and the threatening of our infrastructure and that sort of thing. In addition, we need to reduce our salt use. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of minutes. reduce soil erosion, and obviously anything that improves the soil health, the soil holding capacity, also reduces soil runoff or soil erosion. We need to reduce fertilizer runoff, both from an agricultural perspective as well as in our residential area. We just need to apply fertilizer more intelligent way and at better time. Okay? And then reduce bacteria runoff. Again, that's manure management and better operation of our septic system. So how are we going to do this? There are a number of initiatives that have already happened and are ongoing right now to do that. So I'm going to be using a lot of acronyms in the next couple of minutes, but I'll try to minimize that and at least explain what they mean. So the planning process starts with a RAPS, which is a Watershed Restoration and Protection Strategy Study. Long word for basically, folks went out into the watershed and said, well, what are the problems in the river? So they did some monitoring of the river to find out where the impairments are. Then they went back up and looking in the watershed to determine, well, where are the sources of these pollutants? Where's the salt coming from? Where's the nitrogen coming from? Where's the phosphorus coming from? That sort of thing. Where is the excess flow coming from? So that was all done in a RAPS. And if you want to read the entire document for the Crow River, all you have to do is Google RAPS for the North Fork of the Crow River or for the South Fork of the Crow River, and you will find this document. And it's on the Board of Water and Soil Resources website. Okay? Warn you, it's kind of a lengthy document, but it's really interesting reading, and it highlights exactly where the problems are and what needs to be done to address them. Now, historically, the way a lot of the water management was done in Minnesota was on a county by county basis. But when you're dealing with a river that's got 60 municipalities in it and 9 counties, that's not very efficient. A number of years ago, with funding from the Clean Water Council, which, as Nikki mentioned, I serve on, the One Watershed, One Plan process was implemented. And what that really is that for a given river system, and there are 83 across the state of Minnesota, we will have one plan. So what that meant was all of the 60 municipalities, the 9 counties, the sportsmen's club, the state agencies, the saltwater conservation district, the watershed district, and everybody involved in the water planning process got together over the course of, as you would imagine, a couple of years and developed a plan, comprehensive plan for the entire Crow River Basin. What that plan really lays out is who's going to do what, when are they going to do it, where the funding is coming from, and how are you going to prioritize what needs to be done first, second, third, and fourth. Okay, so it's really a comprehensive plan. And that plan can be, again, obtained. You simply type North Fork Crow River or South Fork Crow River, One Watershed, One Plan in your Google search, and you will find this document. It's about 200 pages. So if you want to fall asleep, it's good reading. But it's very interesting. So this has all been done. We're now into the implementation phase. And to implement the laid out strategies is going to take a lot of different agencies to do it. Just some of that I listed here, kind of taking the lead on it. So the question is, who's going to do all this? And they're different governmental units have different responsibilities in terms of implementing some of these best management practices. Cities, as an example, have stormwater runoff control and authority. They have typically the wastewater treatment plant operation, right? So that's where a lot of the salt is coming from, along with nitrogen and phosphorus from wastewater treatment plants. And that's the city responsibility, in addition to street salting and zoning. Counties have somewhat similar responsibilities for salting, land use zoning, but they also manage septic systems, which are a problem for the bacteria impairment. And they support saltwater conservation districts. In addition, counties often have the feedlot programs, which deal with the manure issue. Saltwater conservation districts, which generally speaking are a part of county government, they work directly with landowners to implement these best management practices I discussed a little bit ago on the cropland. So they are actively engaged in doing it. Watershed districts, and there is a North Fork of the Pool River watershed district. That is, however, limited to the drainage area above Lake Corona. But they also have jurisdictional authority for some of these land use decisions and water planning decisions. And then all of these state agencies are involved in one way or other with water quality in the Crow River Basin. BOSR stands for Board of Water and Soil Resources. The DNR, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and Minnesota Department of Health. In addition, the federal agencies, the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Ag are involved. Now, this slide makes it seem, and my comments makes it seem like the government is going to come in and take care of this problem. Nothing is further from the truth. Because all of the cities, counties, saltwater conservation districts are us. We are the cities. We are the counties. We are the SWC. We are the government. So this is our responsibility working through these units of government to implement this plan. But ultimately, it falls back on the individual citizen to get involved into this process. So I want to make that absolutely clear. This is not a government going to do this thing. We are the government, and it's only going to happen if we do it. So who's going to pay for all this? The estimates for the Crow River alone are for the first 10 years of a 50-year process, because that's the timeline for this plan, is $63 million. That's a lot of money. As I mentioned, there are 83 of these plans being done in the state of Minnesota. That's a huge amount of money. One of the primary funding sources, which we have in Minnesota, we are unique among the 50 states in having this funding source, is what we call the Clean Water Fund. And that is part of the Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment. Hopefully you remember in 2008, we had a constitutional amendment to increase the sales tax on everything we buy. I think it was 1/6 of 1%. And that money is to go directly to environmental programs. A third of those dollars go to the Clean Water Fund, which is about $125 million a year. The Clean Water Council, which I serve on, was established by the governor and legislature to make recommendations to them on how that $125 million a year should be allocated. One of the things that the Clean Water Council has done over the last couple of years is allocated about $50 million per year to each of the watersheds that has a completed One Watershed, One Plan. That includes the Crow River. So this biennium, the Crow River watershed area will receive a little over $1 million, if I remember correctly, in order to help them implement some of the plans and the best management practices I talked about. In addition, we have the Lessard-Sams Outdoor Heritage Council Fund. That is also part of the Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment. Those dollars, some of those dollars, also go toward improving water quality in the sense that that money is specifically set aside for wildlife habitat purposes. But in Worthington, Minnesota, as an example, the Lessard-Sams money was used to buy about 100 acres of cropland, converted to prairie, primarily for pheasant and duck habitat. But the area they chose to buy turned out to be right above the well field for the city. And they did it deliberately. So it protects the city's well system from being contaminated by nitrate. So everybody benefits. So many of the Lessard-Sams Outdoor Heritage Council funds are being used in that same manner. And finally, it's the Environmental Natural Resources Trust Fund, the NTRTF, okay, long acronym. Basically, it's gambling money. When you buy lottery tickets, if you buy lottery tickets, part of those proceeds go toward this fund. It's about $25 million a year or so. And those funds also go toward clean water purposes as well as wildlife habitat. So those are the main funding sources. In addition, we have some state general funds and bonding funds. watershed districts and watersheds typically have the ability to levy funds for specific projects, which the North Fork of the Crow River watershed has done. The federal dollars primarily for wastewater treatment plant updates and agricultural best management practices, and then municipalities and counties. But again, where do they get all their money? From us taxpayers. So really falls back on us again. So we are paying for all of it. So what can we as individuals do to reduce the cost of these big ticket items? A couple of different things. We can improve our lawn care to reduce our runoff. So one easy thing, increase your mower cut height to a minimum of 3 inches. It turns out that the rooting depth of grass plants is proportional to how high the grass is above the ground. So if you increase the cut height, you increase the rooting depth, you have more capacity for water or rainfall to infiltrate, and it can hold more before it starts to run off. So 3-inch added minimum. We can aerate. I did some research a number of years ago in the 4 west metro suburbs, Plymouth, Maple Grove, Eden Prairie, and Lake Minnetonka. We sampled the compaction of 50 lawns in each of those 4 communities and found out that basically below about 2 inches, which is kind of a sod layer for these new homes, the ground was as hard as concrete. Roots couldn't penetrate it, nothing could penetrate it because it was compacted during the construction process. So we need to, and this is very typical. If you look at the construction around the Delano area, which I always do when I see it, they run it over with these big pieces of equipment and compact the heck out of it and put a little black dirt over it and then either seed or sod. Right? So we need to correct that. One way to correct it is by aerating the soil, which just basically pulls plugs out of the soil and allows water to infiltrate and breaks up that hard field. So this is something that really ought to be done on most lawns on an annual basis. And then increase the organic matter. Again, of the 200 lawns that we sampled in these 4 communities that I mentioned, the average organic matter content was 1%. The healthy soil has 5% organic matter. They have a long way to go. So how do you increase your organic matter? Composting the grass clippings, composting your leaves, and maybe top dressing with some organic matter, peat or something of that nature. So all of that will reduce the runoff rate from your lawn significantly. And then fertilizer use. Number one, only use phosphorus-free fertilizer. But I think it's actually hard now to find fertilizer containing phosphorus. But test your soil. Soils ought to be tested at a minimum of every 3 years. And most lawns can get by with 1 application, and that should happen in the fall, not in the spring, which is when everybody tends to want to do it. Okay? Do it in the fall. It allows the grass to use that nitrogen to overwinter a little bit better. But the biggest problem that I think we have, and I've talked to dozens and dozens of people and asked them how big their lawn was, very few people have any idea. They may know how big their lot is. They don't know how much lawn area they have. And if you'd ask them how many square feet you have in the front and how many square feet you have in the back, no one has yet been able to tell me the answer to that question. So basically they're buying a bag of fertilizer and applying it. Whatever the bag is supposed to cover, they put it on their lawn. And that's really usually an over application of the fertilizer. So what we really need to do is measure the lawn area so you only put on what the lawn needs, and we can reduce the amount of phosphorus and nitrogen going downstream. Herbicide application is the same thing. You cannot do a proper herbicide application unless you measure your lawn area accurately. So I can't emphasize that strongly enough. And then the other thing is to make sure you are identifying the problem weeds, not simply using an herbicide cocktail to kill every possible weed in the world. That really is a waste of resources and has a high potential to contaminate our water system. So that's called a preemptive application. Simply go out and spray because you might have dandelion. Not that you do, but you might, so you're going to treat it. And that's really not very environmentally sensitive. So what else can we do? We can reduce our salt use. Okay? Number one, by upgrading the water softener to an on-demand water softener, as opposed to a timed water softener. Most of the old water softeners were timed units, so they would run every 2 or 3 or 4 days, however the homeowner set it. Whether or not the tank needed to be recharged. It just happened. The newer systems, in addition to being much more efficient, the newer system work on an on-demand, so they can sense when regeneration needs to occur. Significantly reduces the amount of salt. In my example, and this happens to be my water softener, I upgraded to this unit a number of years ago, I reduced my salt use between 60 and 70%, which is a lot. So in some municipalities, I've mentioned that when the cities are getting close to having a chloride impairment in downstream water bodies, are going around and actually paying homeowners to install these systems because it's so efficient. In addition, I point out it saves me money because I don't have to buy salt all the time. Same thing is true when you are applying salt on your driveway or around businesses. Really need to minimize. If there is salt on the surface after the ice and snow melt, that salt has been wasted. It's not doing any good except washing downstream into our rivers and lakes. If you're interested in more information on this and training, there's a smart salting program run by the Pollution Control Agency, which helps you to learn these things. A really nice video on how to correctly apply salt to snow and ice. And that's at the website shown on the bottom of the slide here. So basically, if you, again, Google Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, smart salting, you will get to that site. And then reduce your carbon emissions, because this climate change thing is a huge driver of the water quality problems that we're facing, right? And a lot of these are not only good for the environment, but they're good for your pocket. High efficiency furnaces and water heaters, better insulation in your house, LED light bulbs, purchasing renewable electricity, purchasing hybrid vehicles. And then two of my pet peeves are reusable grocery bags and bottled water. It is easy to use reusable grocery bags instead of the plastic bag. It is estimated right now that the majority of Americans are ingesting about a credit card of plastic every month. I know that can't be good for us. There's no studies that show how harmful it is, but I'm guessing it's probably not very good for us. Part of it is we get so much plastic in our environment due to grocery bags, tap water, bottles. So drink, and this is not tap water, but bottled water. Okay? So drink your tap water. Generally speaking, bottled water is simply tap water that somebody put in a bottle. So it's no different from your tap water. So reduce that plastic consumption, which takes a lot of energy, a lot of carbon to manufacture and ship and everything else. And just drink your tap water. And then compost organic. So basically all of the things that you've been hearing about for years, but it's very important and also impacts water quality. And then finally, get involved in the process. We are the government, so we need to take ownership of some of these things. Just as an example, right after the last snowfall we had in March, I looked out on my street and I was thinking, why isn't the snow melting on those patches on the street? So I walked out and looked at it. It was salt. So I swept it up. 2.5 gallons of salt in this little space that you see on the bottom picture. Now, I don't want to beat up on the city of Delano, but this is either an equipment malfunction or an operator error. If it's equipment malfunction, then we need to have the city get better equipment. If it's an operator error, we need to train our equipment operators better. So again, we need to get involved with the city and say, this is not acceptable. I noticed the same thing about 2 weeks after this. I was biking across the bridge in Rockford, across the Crow River Bridge, and there was literally a 1/4 inch of salt across that entire bridge, not doing anybody any good. And obviously, that's on the bridge going directly into the Crow River. That's really unnecessary. So that's a county function. So again, this is on us. We need to get involved in these activities in order to make improvements in the Crow River ecosystem. And finally, I just want to leave you with this thought that all of these impacts that I described are going to happen if we continue to pollute and contaminate the Crow River. We're not God. We didn't make this system. We can't prevent some of these negative things from happening. We can prevent the cause of the negative things. We can stabilize those stream flows. We can reduce salt contamination. We can reduce nitrate contamination. We don't have the power to avoid the negative impact when we contaminate the river. So we have a responsibility, I think, to our children and our grandchildren to preserve and protect these wonderful resources that we've been given. And I think in addition to the economic and environmental things, there's a moral imperative for us to do some of these things. So with that, I will be happy to take any questions.
Yeah, and we were thinking maybe of putting questions in the chat if people are comfortable doing that. And so, yeah, if you have questions, maybe put those in the chat. There's been a couple of comments coming through, so maybe I'll start with those, John. One comment from Mark was that agricultural impact is a multi-agency and industry matter. And I think this ties into a question that came up for me. How do we, you talked a lot about that need to have for soil, for the land to be able to hold the water longer before it gets diverted into our rivers and our surface waters. How would you recommend, or do you have a recommendation for farmers, landowners, like the first steps to take, or the first, for people who are like brand new to this idea, or agricultural, farmers who maybe aren't doing the cover cropping yet in the no-till, kind of those first steps to educate, and then maybe get support in terms of resources on how to begin that transition?
Sure. I think the support is an easy one, and that's to go to your local soil and water conservation district. They are fully aware of all of these practices, and they can tailor a treatment system for a given field or a given farm. And what exactly is done is going to vary depending upon, a farmer's operation. But basically, there's a number of fairly common techniques. One is cover crops. Interesting enough, I go out to North Dakota duck hunting, and the farmer whose land we hunt on plants turnips and radishes in his corn rows. So when he harvests the corn, the turnips and the radishes come up, and then he lets his cattle graze them. That's a perfect example of cover crops. Other farmers I know, and you'll see them around the Delano area, that when I go biking, they leave the crop residue, the corn or the soybean, on top of the field during the winter time. And that really holds the soil in place. It reduces the amount of fertilizer loss because it reduces the amount of runoff. And then changing our cropping patterns. The University of Minnesota has got a huge initiative called the Forever Green Program, where they're looking at different types of cropping systems, like kernza and other crops, which would be perennials. So you plant them once, they stay on the land for 3 to 5 years, instead of our corn and soybean rotation. So those are some of the common practices that are used, and we're just going to have to use more and more of those. Interestingly enough, I don't want to go on too long, but there are a number of the farm commodity organizations like Cargill, Land O'Lakes, and some of the other groups that are heavily invested in this initiative because they see the benefit to themselves from a marketing perspective both from the alternative crops as well as a different way to grow corn and soybeans. So they are really working on this along with all of the government agency partners and many, many farm producers.
Okay. All right. Well, we have some more questions coming in. So this one, what plants can be used to stop erosion on the bank of a river?
There are a number of different plants. I'm not as familiar with river as I am with lakes, but on lakes, rivers are somewhat similar. Pretty much anything that's got a really decent deep rooting depth. Okay. The problem with turf is that rooting depth is 2 or 3 inches. Most of our native grasses, for instance, can have rooting depth up to 5 feet, and trees generally have much deeper rooting systems. So all of those tend to be able to grow deeper and hold the soil. One of the reasons that the buffer ordinance was adopted in Minnesota for public waters, including along rivers, is because of the natural plant's ability to develop deep rooting systems. And when you develop deep rooting systems, you can't stop the erosion that's occurring because of the altered hydrology, but you can slow it down. So a lot of that has been happening.
Okay, and this next question is there talk of a scenic river designation on the Crow River? And if so, how many feet would be required in distance from the river to the building?
You know, I have not heard anything about a scenic river designation for the Crow River. That's not something I've heard anyone speak of. So I guess I don't know.
Okay. Let's see, then we have another question. What are the rules for drain tiles and the distance required from the end to the river?
I don't think there are any. I think drain tiles are really, because they're on private land, they're totally a private thing. There may be one watershed in the state, I think it's the Pomme de Terre watershed, that has some rules and regulations about about producers having to register or at least show where their tile lines are. But that's very unusual. Most of the tile drainage lines are simply put in by the landowner, and he or she is the only one who knows where they are and the extent of it. And in terms of discharge, you can pretty much discharge them if you're on your property wherever you want.
And then there's a question, is there an effort to clean the junk out of the Crow River? People mostly have dumped barbed wire, concrete blocks, even tires in the river that runs through our property. That's from Lori. So,
to my knowledge, there is not a comprehensive program established by anyone to do that. There are volunteer efforts, kind of like Clean the Road Ditch, where volunteers will go out and pick up debris along the banks of the river. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the Rockford High School used to do that. I can't tell you if they do it anymore, but they were doing it for a period of time. So they go out along the Crow River in the Rockford area and then pick up whatever they could, tires and things like that. So there are different initiatives across the state. There is not a comprehensive program to remove this type of debris from the river.
Okay, this is in the river. You know, it's thrown in the river. So it's not on the banks. You can see it in the water.
No, I understand. As I mentioned earlier, before we started, the first picture on my first slide, last summer when the river was low, there was a mattress sitting out in the middle of the river. I don't think anybody is making a concerted effort to go and pick that material out of the river. Probably something we need to look at. But.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, do you have a thought on, the organization that would sort of spearhead something like that in terms of reaching out or making a request?
Yeah, the organization for the Crow River would be the Crow River Organization of Water. Would probably be the group I would approach. to see if they could organize something. They have a presence up and down the river, obviously. You could do it on a county by county basis, but that would probably be less efficient than having this Crow River Organization of Water. And the Crow River Organization of Waters is basically I think it's a group made up of partly the counties and the municipalities of the river. So they would probably be the group to approach.
Okay. And then Mark has a question to ask.
Well, points of fact and problem, all this, for Lori, like the trash, some of that trash has probably been in there decades, many, many decades, and it's not going to be easy fix. You point, John, about New Orleans. One of the problems that New Orleans shares with the city of Venice, they pump a lot of the wall water out, and then literally the city is sinking. So there's problems with that. But in trying to deal with this matter, you're dealing with agriculture, industry, land development, private ownership. My brother had a house in St. Michael's. He had an old nightmare that the land developer came in, literally took off all the topsoil and hauled it away for sale of some sort, and then built the houses by digging into the clay and putting the house basements in there. So every time it rained, the water head to the local creek and filled up every basement because there was no permeation down. It's just a clay. So we have land development aspects that plays into it. You have agriculture. Those district ditches have been down there for decades. They were pressured, not to mention farmers did have for a long time wetlands, and they rotated crops. But because of industry pressure and government through the industry, through the government's pressured too many of the farmers to go monoculture or just specialize in one area, or to clear off every bit of land to produce so much food so they get more food, more crops for more sale. So that I'm trying to get to, this is a multifaceted aspect, and these industries and these people with money can get at our government to pull the strings and say, we need to go this way, but the end result is we're going the wrong way.
And Mark,
That can be a quick answer to this.
do you have a specific question that you wanted to ask that ties into this?
I don't know if there is a single answer on all this, but unfortunately it's a cultural change. How do we change our culture into all this? Because like the salt usage, it's been much more greater usage in that respects.
So
Mark, you've gotten muted. Yeah, you're muted. Do you want to?
How do we change the society? How would change culture and everything? That is the basic thing. We need to change a whole lot, not just a little bit, but everyone's attitudes and such.
Yeah, so
that's the biggest question. How do we change so much of everything to make what we need happen? Not just of the river, but so much of everything else.
Yeah, really good point. So it's the systems approach. And I don't know, John, do you have a comment about that?
You know, I don't, not on changing people's minds and attitudes. That's something I think we have all, I say everybody's been working on for years and years and years. I see Paul Nelson on there. I know he's working on. I will say though that trying to modify the agricultural cropping system, that is where this Forever Green at the university program at the University of Minnesota is really working on quite diligently. And their challenge is to develop concurrently both a supply for Kernza as an example and a market. So without a market, there's no reason for farmers to plant it. And without a supply, there's no reason for the industry, the food products industry, to develop products with it. Even though Kernza has been shown to be very palatable, they use it in muffins, they use it in beer, all got love. And so they use it in a lot of products, but trying to develop concurrently the market and the supply chain at the same time is really challenging. But they're working on it and they're making really great headway. And there are a number of other crops also that they're working on to do that. because basically, it takes a lot of time to do this because the crops have to be, you have to make them profitable. But we have to realize that corn and soybeans did accidentally become the great crops of the American agricultural system. They were developed through university programs. So there's no reason that university program can't develop new crops that we can use in the same fashion that we're using corn and soybeans. So I have a lot of hope for that program.
Good. Okay, well, we'll take a few more questions here. There's quite a few coming in. So first one is magnesium safer than salt?
Well, magnesium is a salt. So you get magnesium chloride, you still have the chlorine there. So when, in fact, what Clean Water Council Policy Committee did a number of years ago is we adopted a policy recommending the state require labeling of ice melt, for lack of a better term, not product, but for salts that melt ice, so that people knew what they were buying. So whether it's magnesium chloride or sodium chloride, it's the chloride that's the problem. So the answer is probably not a lot better. Better not to use it at all, which obviously for safety reasons isn't always possible.
Okay. And then is there still a program with the Soil and Water Conservation District where they share the cost with a landowner to create a rainwater pond?
You know, yes, there are programs that are funded, again, with Clean Water Fund to develop rain gardens. They aren't always through Soil and Water Conservation District. Some of those dollars go to counties, some of them go through municipalities. So a lot of times the cities are more involved in the rain garden construction than Soil and Water Conservation District or Watershed District. So those are other sources to look at.
Let's see, we have some great comments from everyone. If you haven't checked out the chat, there's some good chat going on there about bringing your own bags to Coburns and encouraging other people. And then a general question, how clean do you think the Crow River is?
Well, as I mentioned, it has 40 impairment. From the time I did my master's research on the Crow River in, I'll tell you, it was 1977, 78, so a long time ago. The river has gotten worse, especially with regard to the altered hydrology. So in many instances, the river is significantly worse. However, there have been some improvements in the water. We don't have as many forever pesticides like DDT and things like that in the river as we used to. There are probably more fish in the river now than there used to be, even though there's still many reaches that are impaired for fish. But it's probably not quite as bad as it might have been back in the heyday of pollution. We were dumping sewage directly into the river from many of these municipalities. Now these municipalities, by and large, have wastewater treatment plants. So that certainly has been an improvement. What we've lost ground is from non-point source pollution, primarily the agricultural area. So from point sources, we've made improvements, but from non-point sources, we've probably lost ground. And certainly hydrologically, we've lost a lot of ground.
Okay, well, and that's all. I think I got all the questions. Did anyone else have a question to ask? Well, I guess with that, we can wrap it up. Thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, John, for sharing all this information with us.
You're welcome, and thanks everyone for participating.
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks, John.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you much.
Yes, thank you.
How much more work to be done in a long time, though.
Yes, there's a lot of work to be done.
Question is, where is it going to take us, and how do we get there?
One step at a time.
Lots and lots of little bitty steps to try and make up for the big steps going backwards.
Yes, I agree.
Thank you. Talk to you later.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Good night.